one nation, and only one, meets the specifications of this prophecy. It points unmistakably to the United States of America. Now, what I want to do is go through the history of the United States to show you that in its founding documents you have this idea of one nation composed of two kingdoms, separate one from the other. Now, the history of the United States can be divided into two great periods. The first period is known as the colonial period, and the second period is known as the constitutional period. You know, the constitutional fathers, men such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison, and Benjamin Franklin, knew three things. These were the constitutional fathers that arose around the year 1798 to write the founding documents of the United States. They knew three things. First of all, they knew the history of the church in the Middle Ages. And the founding fathers knew the history of the church in the Middle Ages. They also knew the history of the United States in the colonial period. And they also knew their Bibles, as we're going to notice. Now, the constitutional fathers knew, and they were living at the end of the 1260 years, that when church and state are joined together, the automatic result is persecution. For example, they knew the history of John Huss, that man who was convicted and burned at the stake for his religious convictions. They knew, for example, that he had been kept in subhuman conditions in prison squalor. They knew that false witnesses were called to testify against him. They knew that he had violated no civil laws. They knew that he was tried for the religious convictions of his conscience. They knew that he was called before a religious tribunal, much like the Sanhedrin at first. He knew that that religious tribunal had pronounced a death sentence against him. And they knew that then they took him to the emperor, to have the emperor stamp his imprimatur upon the sentence of death. And they knew that because of his religious convictions, he was burned at the stake. They knew the history of the church in the Middle Ages when church and state are united or joined together. You know, I've been in the palace of the Inquisition in Lima, Peru. It's a depressing experience. They actually have models where they show the types of torture that were used against people for no reason other than they did not agree with the church. Torture and death. Some were even burned at the stake, like John Huss was burned at the stake. And it wasn't the church who did it, but the church used the sword of the state in order to accomplish its purpose. You see, the constitutional fathers not only knew the history of Europe when church and state are joined together, they also knew the history of the colonial period in the United States. You know, there are many people who misunderstand or don't understand the colonial period. Do you know that during the colonial period, which begins at around 1620, when the Pilgrims arrived in the United States, atheist Jews, Quakers, and Baptists were deprived of their religious rights because they did not agree with the established church of the colonies, which was the Puritans, or was the Anglican Church. Did you know that there were Sunday laws in the colonies, and if you didn't go to church on Sunday, you could be whipped, you could be fined, you could be jailed, and in the case of 3 colonies, you could be executed for not coming to church on Sunday? Did you know that they actually cut off the ears of Quakers for coming back when they had been exiled from the colonies? If they came back once, they cut off one ear. If they came back the second time, they cut off the second ear. And if they caught them the third time, they executed them for their religious convictions. Did you know that only people who professed to be loyal to the established church could occupy positions in the civil government? And also, the government paid the salaries of the ministers, interestingly enough. And so the church and the state were joined together, and as a result, you had persecution. You know, many people know the story, for example, of Roger Williams. Roger Williams arrived in the colonies in 1629. He pastored a church there, but he started teaching separation of church and state. He said there are to be 2 kingdoms in this country, absolutely, but they're supposed to be separate, one from another, because that's what Jesus taught. Are you seeing what the 2 horns are? Jesus said 2 kingdoms in the same nation, separate, one from another. And of course, what he was teaching went over like a lead balloon. And so they banished him from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he himself says that towards the end of 1635 and the beginning of 1636, he had to flee for 3 weeks through huge snowdrifts to get out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, because he had been banished, and if they found him in there, they could throw him in prison or they could even execute him. And so he ended up in Rhode Island, and he established the capital of Rhode Island, which is Providence. That's interesting that he would call that city Providence. And so the founding fathers knew the history of what happens when church and state are united together in Europe. They knew what happened when church and state are joined together in the United States in the colonial period. They also knew their Bibles. In several places they wrote about how they knew that because the Jews allied themselves with the Roman state, that led to the death of Jesus Christ. They knew 3 things. They knew the history of Europe in the Middle Ages, they knew the colonial period, and they knew their Bibles. And they knew that when these 2 kingdoms become one, automatically there is persecution. And so the Constitutional Fathers, knowing this, when they wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and the Constitution was ratified in 1787, and the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, was ratified in 1791, they said, we're going to have a different system of government in this nation that we're establishing. We are going to have, yes, church and state, but church and state are going to be separated, like Jesus taught. 2 kingdoms in one nation. The same 2 kingdoms that Jesus Christ recognized.